This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 635 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Over the last handful of days, I've barely gotten any sleep, and I've angered 6 different fan bases on the internet. But I wouldn't want it any other way. The NFL draft is over. It's done. The updates to the late round prospect guide were sent out on Saturday night, so anyone who bought that guide now has updated profiles and rankings. And if you want those updated profiles and rankings, you can still purchase the guide for $14.99 over on lateround.com. Each year, my response to the draft is not to do some episode where I go over my updated rankings. I'll save that for next week. Again, you can get that in the prospect guide if you want it. And I'll have rankings this week on the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon as well. Rather than just go through those rankings though, I like to try to look at things from a different perspective. We can learn a lot about what a team is thinking through the NFL draft. We have free agency, but teams aren't forced to make open decisions in free agency. With the draft, they're forced to do something in front of all of us, and that can offer up some interesting insights. So today I'm going to dig into some of the interesting things that teams seem to show us during this year's draft. I won't get into every relevant player for fantasy football. Again, if you want that info, my prospect guide is ready to be consumed. We've got all summer to talk about the players. I want to look into what teams may have been thinking when they took those players first. Now, before getting into things, I want to let you know there's no better time than today to sign up for FanDuel Fantasy. For users who have yet to make a deposit on FanDuel Fantasy, you can deposit today to receive 2 free entries. All you have to do is deposit a minimum of $10 into your FanDuel DFS account, and you'll be instantly rewarded with 2 free vouchers. This is a limited time offer, so be sure to deposit now and play for free. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Just because a team drafted a wide receiver in the first round or high in the first round does not automatically mean they don't like the existing wide receivers on that team. Yes, I'm talking about Elijah Moore and Garrett Wilson, and Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown, who was essentially like a draft pick for them, and Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamison Williams. Wide receivers are valuable. We're seeing that this offseason with the kind of money that they're getting, and the way that teams are lining up to trade for studs. It was not a surprise to see 6 wide receivers go in the first 18 picks of the draft. It does create a really interesting situation in fantasy football, though. Should you be concerned about the existing wide receivers on those teams from a fantasy perspective? Are Elijah Moore and Devontae Smith and Amon-Ra St. Brown now sells in Dynasty? If their market values don't change, yes, they would be sells, because this doesn't really help them per se. But my guess is that the market is going to overestimate what this does to those players and their long-term potential. Devontae Smith was a stud prospect, and even though his rookie season was overshadowed by Jalen Waddles and Jamar Chase's, he still had a really good year. He's also in the right percentile group in my year 2 model to have a good year 2 and year 3 outlook. We just have to hope that the Eagles move towards a more pass-heavy scheme, which is entirely possible with the addition of A.J. Brown, at least more pass-heavy than they were down the stretch last year. Elijah Moore is in a similar percentile bucket as Devontae Smith in my year 2 model, which for those of you who don't know, the year 2 model looks at a player's prospect score to go along with how well he did as a rookie to help project how he's going to do in years 2 and 3. Garrett Wilson was a better prospect in my model than Elijah Moore, but not by much. Moore's still a stud. The Jets are just clearly trying to surround Zach Wilson with as many playmakers as possible so that there aren't any excuses. As I wrote in my prospect guide, this likely hurts the ceiling for both Garrett Wilson and Elijah Moore if Zach Wilson does not take a step forward. There's nothing wrong with some wide receiver 2s in fantasy football, though, which is still possible over the next couple of years for both of those players because good players command high target shares. But in order to be one of those duos that are both wide receiver 1s in fantasy, you generally need a good offense to elevate them, or at least an above average one. And that's the question mark. But that's the question mark for everyone. There's still a non-zero chance here that Elijah Moore is just better than Garrett Wilson. Now, I think that we should favor Wilson, but this is the probability game that you've got to play when seeing if you should buy the dip. And the Amon-Ra St. Brown stuff is absolutely exhausting. For the 1,000th time, we know that he's not going to produce like he did down the stretch last year. We know that TJ Hockenson and DeAndre Swift were hurt. If that was the actual thought, if people actually thought that Amon-Ra St. Brown was going to continue what he did down the stretch last year, then he would have a much higher startup ADP. Let's look at this from a football perspective. Jameson Williams is the absolute perfect complement to Amon-Ra St. Brown. It makes total sense as a pairing. Williams is the best down the field wide receiver in this class. St. Brown is great in the slot, and he can do a lot of great things close to the line of scrimmage. Episode 622 really outlines my feelings on St. Brown. I introed with a discussion not necessarily about whether he was a buy or a sell, but the fact that he's really got to screw up in his second year for him to dramatically lose market value. So if he loses significant value because of this pick, which on that episode I talked about the Lions drafting a wide receiver, but if he loses significant value because of Jameson Williams being there, I may end up being a buyer of St. Brown. He's a really good football player, and the list of players who did what he did as rookies is really, really good. But I'd listen to episode 622 for a breakdown. So to reiterate, just because a team drafts a wide receiver high does not mean that team hates the wide receivers already on their team. Having depth at the position is a good thing. And each of the three wide receivers who got hurt from these moves in fantasy, Devontae Smith, Elijah Moore, Amon-Ra St. Brown, each of them had enough room on their roster for a top wide receiver to join them and complement them. Honestly, none of this should be surprising. I've been talking about this for the last month and a half on this show. That instead of buying Devontae Smith and Elijah Moore and Amon-Ra St. Brown pre-draft, you should wait until after the draft. Because this was bound to happen, and they were bound to lose value in the market. They definitely took a hit, but the hit that they took is likely to look too extreme in the market. Likely. We'll see where things end up. Two other wide receivers I want to touch on from the first round are Chris Olave and Jahan Dotson. And it's only because early rookie draft average draft position data is showing that Olave is not part of that top tier of wide receivers, and Jahan Dotson is getting selected after George Pickens. From a process standpoint, I don't totally agree. I honestly think that this might be a reflection of all the early declare talk from fantasy analysts like myself. Yes, early declare status, it matters. Yes, first round early declares have not fared well over the last decade. But it's not absolutely everything. We need context. Chris Olave had an incredible production profile with a great breakout age while playing alongside potential stud NFL wide receivers. His extra season in college did absolutely nothing in my prospect model to help him. And even still, he graded out as the second best wide receiver in this class in my model, behind only Drake London. Jahan Dotson ranked as the wide receiver 6, but he was significantly ahead of the second round wide receivers, including my guy, Sky Moore. I can understand going Moore over Dotson in rookie drafts, because the landing spot is so enticing for Moore, and I love Sky Moore. But from strictly a process standpoint, it seems people are underselling Dotson the player. He's not an early declare, but he ranked in the top 10 in 2 of the 3 production metrics that my model looks at. He has arguably the best hands in this class. And while he's sort of a slot archetype, my top comp for him all offseason has been T.Y. Hilton. I don't think you should ignore draft capital, even if you think Dotson was overdrafted in this draft. Since 2011, 49% of first-round wide receivers have given you a season with 12 or more PPR points per game during their first 3 years in the league. That number's 35% when you look at second-round wideouts. Looking at a 16-point per game threshold, the numbers are 21% versus 15%. So there's inherently a better floor baked in for a first-round wide receiver. I'm not saying you should solely draft off of that. Clearly, there's more to it. I have Sky Moore and Jahan Dotson in the same tier after all. I think that you can get Sky Moore after the big 5 wide receivers are off the board. I'm not blindly following draft capital here. I'm just saying that how these teams spend their capital, while sometimes there are head scratchers, we can still leverage the information. I'm just surprised that it's not some one-off thing where Dotson is going behind a player like George Pickens. It's the actual average. It's how the average draft is going. And I'm saying that as someone who liked Pickens a lot pre-draft. I'm also not saying that Pickens is incapable of beating out Dotson. Not at all. Dotson might completely flop. This is a podcast, though, about process. And I think process-wise, it makes sense to go Dotson over Pickens. And don't fade non-early declares just for the sake of fading non-early declares. That's all embedded in my model. And my model specifically loves it, some Chris Olave. Let's talk about the round 2 running backs. We had Breece Hall and Kenneth Walker both go in round 2. That was predictable. And while some will question the landing spots, I think they were also expected. Because there weren't many spots for these guys to go to where they would just walk in to this really, really good offense and just dominate. Hall lands in New York, and the Jets are revamping things on offense. Funny enough, I actually talked about this exact example on an episode this offseason, where I talked about how if Hall went to the Jets, it would crush Michael Carter as opposed to crushing Breece Hall. Carter's a change of pace back selected on day 3 last year. He's not going to split a backfield 50-50 with Breece Hall unless Breece Hall ends up being nothing like we think he's going to be. And yes, I know there was a recent report saying that there would be a running back by committee in New York. But how are we defining that? Because I agree, Carter's not going to just completely go away. But Hall is still going to see the majority of that work in the backfield. Or that's at least how we should project things. Now, Walker going to Seattle is the most Pete Carroll thing of all time. We knew there were some question marks about his pass catching ability, but he found a home that's been efficient with their running backs the last handful of years on the ground. Now, that probably has a lot to do with Russell Wilson, but as long as Pete Carroll's around, that team's going to want to run. They're going to want to establish it. I do think the pass catching potential is still a question mark for Kenneth Walker, though. Even though personnel drives this, it's not like Seattle's been this location for high target shares at the position. He's not going to a place where they're going to force targets no matter what. In 2021, Seattle ranked 30th in running back target share. 2020, they were 16th. 2019, 24th. 2018, they were 15th. 2017, they were 21st. 2016, they were 22nd. You get the picture. I think the Walker pick signaled that things are really, really questionable with Chris Carson right now. More than anything else. And the Seahawks value running backs more than other teams do. So they ended up taking Walker with a premium pick. And speaking of team running back target shares, how about James Cook going 63rd overall to the Bills? Cook is one of the best pass-catching running backs in this class. If you recall, the Bills were really close to signing J.D. McKissic this offseason before he went back to Washington. They're clearly trying to get a dynamic pass catcher back in their backfield. That's why I don't really care about their recent running back target shares. They've ranked 29th in running back target share in each of the last 2 seasons, but they haven't had a great pass-catching running back to throw to. I would expect that to change with James Cook. Cook also weighed a little bit heavier than expected at the combine. He can still see some early down work too, and it's not like the Bills are afraid to give big workloads to smaller backs. Devin Singletary was dominating touches down the stretch last year, and even though that was largely out of necessity, he's only a few pounds heavier than James Cook. I love this landing spot for Cook. He's my RB3 in this class. Now, I don't want to touch on quarterback for that long because I don't think there's a ton to say. From a dynasty perspective, the only player you should spend a true premium pick on is Kenny Pickett, and that's only in Superflex formats. He's always been pegged as the safe option in this class who lacks a ceiling. But the Steelers are getting a lot of good playmakers, and Matt Canada's offense is going to get Kenny Pickett moving around. He still has some juice from a rushing perspective. Now, with the other quarterbacks, what's interesting about their slide in the draft is that Ritter, Willis, and Corral all landed in spots where they could see the field sooner rather than later. Like, even though they went later in the draft, they're still not in bad spots. Especially Ritter and Corral. I actually expect both of those players to get some starts this season. And that should inherently drive up their Superflex prices. Even if they had bad draft capital. Think about Davis Mills last year and how things went for him year 1 to year 2. It's not bankable, but all of these teams aren't going to be able to land a quarterback next season. And the quarterbacks that we're talking about, they have some mobility. They run the ball more than a Davis Mills does. Quarterback is currency in Superflex. That's what makes these guys high risk, high reward picks in those rookie drafts. Now, speaking of Kenny Pickett, the Steelers added 2 wide receivers in the draft in George Pickens and Calvin Austin. They're 2 players who are very, very different. Pickens is more of the traditional X. Austin is a short receiver who profiles more as a speedy slot guy. Honestly, I think Austin is sort of the Ray McLeod replacement. Now, does this really signal anything? Maybe. The Steelers were bound to go after a wide receiver or 2 in this draft because they had no depth behind Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool. But this also gives them a lot of flexibility. Deontay Johnson still needs to get a new deal, and Chase Claypool didn't take a step forward this past year. This is why I just said that I wouldn't be surprised if Pickens ends up better than Jahan Dotson. and that the Dotson talk was more about process, not results. George Pickens has an honest shot to be the Steelers' wide receiver 1 in 2023. Because what if the Steelers don't re-sign Diontae Johnson? And is it that hard to imagine that Pickens just ends up being better than Chase Claypool? So to me, the move with Pickens, and to a lesser extent Austin, was about filling depth, but also is about flexibility. I'm also interested to see how Pittsburgh deploys their wide receivers here in 2022, because Claypool and Diontae Johnson played very few snaps in the slot last year. Claypool actually played the slot more than Diontae Johnson, and Pickens was not a slot guy at Georgia. He doesn't profile to be that kind of player. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some interesting rotation there this season, and maybe even seeing a lot of Chase Claypool there. We saw some round 3 running backs in this draft too. Historically, we've actually seen a decent drop-off from round 1 to round 2 to round 3 running backs and how they've performed in fantasy football. So don't think that all day 2 picks are the same. But in round 3, Rachaad White went to Tampa Bay, Ty Davis Price went to San Francisco. White was someone my model comped very favorably to David Johnson. David Johnson, if you recall, was drafted by the Cardinals. Remember who their head coach was when he was drafted? Bruce Arians. You know who's in Tampa Bay's front office right now? Bruce Arians. The problem with White is that he's likely going to have to wait for Leonard Fournette to leave. But Tampa Bay needed depth at running back, and White can at least play a pass-catching role for them right away. Fournette's still likely going to be a bell cow in the short term, but White did rank as the 3rd best running back in my model post-draft. I don't have him ranked there, but he is good. With Ty Davis Price, it's Kyle Shanahan and the 49ers. You never know what's going through their minds with running backs. I do think this is way worse for a player like Trey Sermon than Elijah Mitchell. Davis Price was not beloved in my model. And I'm curious as to why he was the pick, because like Mitchell, he's not that much of a pass catcher. Or he wasn't in college. He's going to complement Mitchell more than just take over this backfield. It's hard to attach draft capital to a Kyle Shanahan running back and say that it matters a whole lot. But just given the player, I think this is okay. This is an okay outcome for Elijah Mitchell. Mitchell's shown us that he's good, and Davis Price looked pretty average to below average in my model. And when it comes to running back investments, even though it absolutely happens, the hit rates for day 3 running backs are still not great. You'd rather throw darts at running backs in the late rounds than wide receivers, but don't go crazy with how you rank them. From 2011 to 2019, so we have a sample where all players that we're looking at here had a shot to play 3 years in the league. Fewer than 9% of running backs drafted on day 3 during this time frame had one single season with 14 or more PPR points across their first 3 in the league. And this is not counting undrafted players for the record. Aaron Jones has been the biggest hit probably, and a lot of the players in this sample are not consistently good year after year after year, like Myles Gaskin. A lot of that has to do with the yearly volatility and investment that teams make in the position. It just takes one player in a backfield to derail an existing player, like we saw with Breece Hall and Michael Carter. So at least be aware of that before you reach for one of these guys in your rookie draft. With that being said, I think there are some really interesting landing spots and things to dig into with these day 3 running backs. Dameon Pierce is arguably already the Texans' best running back. He didn't carry a huge workload in college, that's kind of a red flag, but he had great tackle breaking numbers per touch. There's definitely some concern, but he was an early day 3 pick who could easily be one of the exceptions to the rule. Tyler Algier went to Atlanta, and my model likes him a good bit. I think the fact that the Falcons didn't spend up to get a running back does not mean that they're content with their running back room. They actually released Mike Davis. They just have way bigger holes to fill. It was smart for them to not get a day 2 running back. And then there's Isaiah Spiller on the Chargers, and that's another interesting one. LA's been trying to fill the Melvin Gordon void for a couple of years now, but guys like Larry Roundtree weren't cutting it. It makes sense that LA wouldn't spend huge capital on a running back because he's likely going to play a part-time role. But Spiller now has the opportunity for some work to go along with a lot of upside as a handcuff. Keontae Ingram going to Arizona was interesting. He got similar draft capital as Eno Benjamin, and that signals the Cardinals are probably cool with riding out James Conner. But they did need some competition for that number 2 spot. But there's one player who was drafted on day 3 that I'm insanely intrigued by, and that's Isaiah Pacheco. I wrote this in the prospect guide, but the biggest issue with Clyde Edwards-Helaire has been his explosiveness in the NFL. And by the way, Pacheco went to Kansas City. But last year, Clyde Edwards-Helaire was actually second best in the league in gaining positive yardage per touch on the ground among 100-plus attempt running backs. But he was also last in the league in gaining 20 or more yards. That's likely why they went out and got Ronald Jones. I've hated on Jones for years on this podcast because he's not a good pass catcher. But he's a good runner who has more upside on the ground than CEH has shown so far. Pacheco can fill that void too. He had the best speed score or weight-adjusted 40 time at the combine this year. And get this, of running backs who have been drafted since 2011, listen to the backs who have had a 115 speed score or better while also having a best season touchdown share of at least 35%. Leonard Fournette, Derrick Henry, Robert Turbin, A.J. Dillon, Jonathan Taylor, Breece Hall, and Isaiah Pacheco. You know who Pacheco's top comparable in my model was? Damian Williams. You know who crushed it in Andy Reid's offense? Damian Williams. I'm trying to leave all of my rookie drafts with Isaiah Pacheco. He had a really strong draft capital delta in my model, which is a metric that shows how over or under drafted a player seemed to be. He's the exact type of dart that you want to throw in the later rounds. Now, like I said at the top, plenty of other things happened in this draft. I'm absolutely obsessed with my guy Khalil Shakir landed. Kyle Phillips is not in a bad spot either in Tennessee. I didn't even talk about one of my other favorites, David Bell. There's a lot of other things that happened. But I wanted to highlight some of the more interesting read between the lines stories from the draft and throw in some fantasy advice along the way. So hopefully it helps you wrap your head around this class a little bit better. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Really appreciate it. I'll talk to you later in the week with the Mailbag Show.